"Sir, who is she?" Seaman Apprentice Odell Frayne asked it into the cold of the emptied trainer the morning after, 19 years old and still smelling of yesterday's smoke, and the old man beside him did not answer right away. Dawn came gray through the high slats of the burn building. The steel compartments stood dark and dripping and quiet, the way a thing that has held fire is quiet once the fire is gone, ticking faintly as the metal gave back the last of its heat to the sea air. Water pooled in the low corners. Somewhere, a hose bib wept one slow drop at a time onto a deck plate, and each drop rang like a small bell in all that stillness. The place smelled of char and salt and the particular ash of scorched paint, and it smelled, underneath, of the thing every damage control sailor learns to smell before he learns anything else, which is how close it had come. Ronan Petrie stood with his coffee going cold in both hands and looked at the compartment where, 12 hours before, a woman he had taken for a contractor had walked into rolling flame and read it like a page and put it out. He was 57, and he had been a Master Chief Damage Controlman for 30 of those years before he ever wore a civilian badge, and he had spent the night not sleeping. "Sit down, son," he said. "That's a long answer. So let the water run backward off the deck plates. Let the smoke draw itself back up into the overhead, and the flame fold itself down into the pan, and the morning become the afternoon before. Let the dead space light off again. It had begun the way every certification begins, with a brief and a boast. The hose team had mustered on the trainer floor at 1,300, 6 of them in fire ensembles the color of ash, and Petty Officer First Class Deke Marlowe had run the brief the way he ran everything. Loud, certain, and very good. He was 32, and he was, by any honest measure, the best pair of hands in the building, and he knew it the way a man knows the color of his own eyes. He talked in paragraphs. He filled the bay with himself. The building itself was a cathedral of controlled violence. Steel mock-ups of a ship's insides stood in rows under the high roof. A mess decks, a berthing, a main space, each one a box that could be made to flood or burn on the turn of a valve in the control booth, each one blackened on the inside by 10,000 fires that had been allowed to live exactly long enough to teach and no longer. Charged hoses lay coiled like sleeping snakes. The air smelled always of wet char and diesel and the ghost of every evolution that had come before. It was a place built on a single hard truth that the fleet had paid for in blood more times than it liked to remember, that a ship at sea is a steel box full of fuel and air and pressure, floating on the one thing that will not put out an oil fire, and that the only thing standing between a crew and the deep is whether the sailors aboard have learned to fight fire in a place exactly like this one before the day they had to fight it for real. That was why the evaluators came, and that was why no one questioned one more quiet woman in loner coveralls with a blank badge, sent to ride a drill and watch. Outside evaluators were furniture. You suited them up, you put them on the tail of the hose where they could not hurt anyone, and you forgot them. Marlowe had forgotten her before the brief was half over. And in the back of the team, on the tail of the hose, stood a woman in loner coveralls with a blank temporary badge and no rank anywhere on her and nothing to say. She was an outside evaluator, they had been told. She would ride the drill and watch. Nobody had looked at her twice. Marlowe looked at her once and made up his mind and said it to the whole team so she would hear it. "Listen up. Don't count on the deadweight the evaluator stuck us with. She'll freeze at the flashover and get somebody cooked. So you watch your own boundaries, and you carry her. Understood? We do this clean, whether the tourist keeps up or not. The trainees laughed, because the instructor laughed. The woman on the tail of the hose said nothing. Her eyes had already left Marlowe. They were on the compartment, on the vent louvers, the boundary bulkheads, the placard by the hatch that gave the spaces fire load. And she read the plan of it the way other people read a page, without effort, without moving her lips, the whole shape of how this fire would live and where it would try to go arranging itself behind her still face. She reached out and rolled the bail of the nozzle a quarter turn under her hand, feeling the detent, and set it back, and the motion was so economical that only one man in the bay saw it. Petrie saw it. Across the floor, coiling a charged line, the old Master Chief felt something turn over in his chest that he had not felt in years and could not yet name. She did not argue with the deadweight. She let it lie where he'd thrown it, and she went to work on the thing that would actually kill someone, which was the gear. In the pre-entry check, she found the fault the way water finds the low place, without hurry. The team pressurized the line, and she walked it, one gloved hand riding the jacket of the hose, feeling the fill, and at the second, coupling, her hand stopped. A soft connection. Not backed off, not leaking yet, but not home either. The kind of soft coupling that holds fine at 90 pounds and lets go at 200 with a compartment full of fire on the other side of the nozzle. She seated it with a half turn. Then she looked at the nozzle Marlowe's second had set, and the pattern was wrong for the space, a wide fog where this overhead wanted a tight one, and she reached past the trainee and reset it without a word. "Wrong pattern," she said. 2 words. "Fix it." Marlowe came down the hose. "You touching my team's gear now." Coupling was soft. Nozzle was wide. Fixed both. Cute. He looked at her, the way a fast man looks at a slow one. He did not check the coupling. That was the tell that answered all of hers. A man sure of his gear checks it when a stranger says it's wrong, if only to prove her wrong. Marlowe did not check it, because checking it might have made him less certain, and certainty was the thing he could not spend. "Stay on the tail of the hose and out of my way. You're here to watch, so watch." She stepped back to the tail. She said, "Understood." 1 word, and it sat in the bay like a stone dropped in still water, rings going out from it that only Petrie felt. Because Petrie had stopped coiling line, he was standing very still now, watching the woman's hands, and his memory had gone to a place he did not visit often, to a steel passageway on a real ship a long time ago, and the way the best damage control men he had ever served with used to walk a charged line with one flat hand, feeling for the soft place, finding it every time. He had thought that pair of hands was one of a kind. He was looking at another one, on the tail of Deke Marlowe's hose, in a contractor's coveralls. That is not, he thought, an evaluator. Evaluator's watch. This one was already fighting the fire in her head before the fire was even lit. He almost said something. 30 years of the Navy had taught him when to speak and when to keep the deck plates under his boots and his mouth shut, and every instinct he owned told him there was a story standing on the tail of that hose that he did not yet have the shape of. So he kept his silence, and he watched her hands, and he thought about the fact that a woman who reseats a soft coupling by feel, without looking, in another man's gear, is not a woman who read about fire in a manual. She had learned that in the dark, on her knees, with the heat coming down. You did not get hands like that from a schoolhouse. You got them from a knight that had tried to kill you and had settled for teaching you instead. The klaxon test sounded, one long note through the steel, and the trainees flinched, and the woman on the tail did not. Marlowe was too good to be cruel with his hands, so he was cruel with the team instead, which is the crueler thing, because a floor will follow an instructor into meanness the way it follows him into fire. The nickname rode the net inside 10 minutes. Deadweight. It went from Marlowe to his second, and from the second to the trainees, low, between the breathing apparatus checks, and it took on the small, ugly warmth a group generates when it has chosen someone to not be. By the time they staged at the hatch, it was just her name. Deadweight, get on the tail. Deadweight, don't trip the team. There is a particular arithmetic to a training floor that Thorne had spent a career learning to read, as clearly as she read smoke. A schoolhouse is a frightened place pretending to be a confident one. The trainees are afraid of the fire, and more afraid of looking afraid, and the instructor is the sun they orbit. And when the instructor decides a person is beneath the team decides it too, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the same animal arithmetic that runs every frightened group. The instructor's contempt is safer to share than to question. So they shared it. They laughed when Marlowe laughed. They said the name when Marlowe said the name. And every one of them who had a private flicker of doubt, and a few of them did, because a few of them had noticed the quiet way she'd reset that nozzle, swallowed the flicker, because a flicker of doubt about the instructor is a dangerous thing to carry on a floor the instructor rules. Seaman apprentice Odell Frayne heard it, and hated it, and said nothing, because Frayne was 19 and terrified, and a terrified man grabs the nearest certainty, and the nearest certainty was the instructor. He had never fought a fire. He did not yet know the thing the woman beside him knew in her spine, which is that fire does not care how loud you are, that it reads you faster than you read it, and that the only thing between a compartment and a funeral is whether someone on the hose has learned to be still inside the heat. The woman on the tail was still. She watched the burn pan through the vision port as the igniters lit the fuel, and the first flame walked up the far bulkhead and rolled along the overhead in a slow orange tide. She watched it the way you watch weather. She read the color of the smoke and the speed of it and the way it banked and layered, and everything she read, she filed without a word, while the heat began to press its palm against the steel and the compartment began to breathe. What she was doing, in that stillness they mistook for uselessness, was the whole of the job. A fire tells you everything if you have learned its language. The color of the smoke tells you what is burning and how hot. The speed of it tells you how much air the fire has found. The way it banks and layers under the overhead tells you where it wants to go and how long you have before it gets there. Marlowe's trainees watched the flame, because the flame is loud and bright and frightening and pulls the eye the way all loud, bright, frightening things do. Thorne watched the smoke, because the smoke is where the fire keeps its secrets, and she had learned, in a place none of them had been, that the ones who watch the flame die watching it, and the ones who watch the smoke live to teach. She was reading a sentence the compartment was writing in gray and black across its own ceiling, and the sentence said, plainly, to anyone who could read it, not yet, but soon, and not that way. Deadweight, Marlowe said over his shoulder, grinning behind his mask. Try not to trip the team. Understood, she said. Then the klaxon and the hatch and the black. If a story about the quiet ones, the ones a whole room writes off right up until the fire starts, has ever put a hook in you, do the small free thing now and subscribe to Honor Tales, because the burn is lit, and you are going to want to be inside that compartment when the deadweight picks up the nozzle. A controlled burn is a promise, and the trainer's promise is that the fire will behave. Most days it keeps that promise. This was not most days. They advanced into a compartment full of night. The smoke had dropped to a hand's breadth off the deck, and the heat came down with it. That heavy banking heat that leans on the shoulders and whispers to a man's body to stop, to lie down where the air still is, to quit. Marlowe drove them forward the loud way, the way that works when everything is fine. Push, 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 and for 20 feet everything was fine. Then Frayne froze. He froze at the fire boundary the way the untrained freeze, all at once, the whole body voting no. He was second on the hose behind Marlowe, and his hands locked on the jacket, and his boots stopped, and he became, in an instant, a stone in the middle of a river of men who needed to move. The advance stalled. The team bunched, and above them the overhead, robbed of the water it should have been taking, began to gather its heat into itself and glow. This is the thing the loud stories never tell you about fire, that it is patient and that it counts. Every second the water stayed off the overhead, the heat that should have been going into the hose stream went instead into the steel, and the steel held it and gave it back, and the gases pooling under the deckhead grew richer and hotter and closer to the temperature at which they no longer need a flame to touch them off. The temperature at which the whole banked ceiling of superheated smoke simply becomes fire all at once, everywhere, in a single breath, over the heads of the men who stalled beneath it. Thorne had a name for that moment, a name the Standard used, and she had watched it kill. She could feel it building now, the way you feel a wave lift under a boat, in the body before the mind, and every instinct she owned was a clock counting down toward the orange. Marlowe felt the stall and did what certain men do, which is press harder in the same wrong direction. He hauled at the boundary bulkhead, trying to push through toward the seat of the fire the short way, the way that looked bravest, and it was the wrong bulkhead. And the woman on the tail of the hose knew it was the wrong bulkhead the way you know a wrong note. "Push!" Marlowe's voice cracked through the mask. "Push! Push! Not that bulkhead," she said. She said it once, flat, through the roar, and it cut because it did not shout. But Marlowe was inside his own certainty now, inside the loud place where fire lives for men like him, and he did not hear the two quiet words, and above the frozen boy, the overhead flashed a deep and living orange, the color that comes just before a compartment decides to kill everyone in it. Somewhere behind the vision port, a drill safety observer's hand moved toward the abort. She did not wait for the abort. She read the orange and she moved. It was not dramatic. Nothing a truly good damage controlman does in a fire is dramatic. Drama is what you get from the ones who are behind the fire, and she was, for the first time all day, exactly even with it. She came up the hose past the bunched team with one hand riding the jacket, found Frayne's locked shoulder, and put her mask to the side of his hood, and said two words. Not kind, not cruel, just true and low enough that they went in under the panic where kindness never reaches. With me. And the boy came. That is the mystery of it. The thing they cannot teach at the schoolhouse, no matter how good the schoolhouse is. That a certain voice, still inside the heat, will unlock a body that all the shouting in the world only welds shut tighter. Frayne's boots came unstuck. She moved him back off the boundary with her, one step, two, and in the same motion her hand took the nozzle from Marlowe's second and rolled the bail to the tight pattern she had set an hour before, and she did not aim it at the flame, because you do not aim at the flame. You aim at the overhead where the heat is banking, and she opened it in short, hard pulses, painting the steel, stealing the heat out of the air a stroke at a time. The orange died back. The overhead cooled and went dark and dripping. The banking heat lifted off their shoulders, and the compartment, which had been deciding something terrible, decided against it. She walked the team down the correct bulkhead, the long way, the right way, toward the seat of the fire, and put it out at its root, and the space went black and wet and steaming and utterly quiet, and the only sound was 6 men breathing through their masks and the small, triumphant hiss of hot steel giving up. The whole thing had taken perhaps 40 seconds. That was the part the trainees could not get their minds around afterward, in the showers and the birthing and the long retelling that would follow her name around that schoolhouse for years. That the difference between a certification drill and a funeral had been 40 seconds and one still pair of hands, and that the hands had belonged to the person they had spent the afternoon teaching themselves to look down on. Fire does not care what you call a woman. It had come for all of them, loud and patient and even. And it had been turned back at the overhead, not by the loudest man in the compartment, but by the quietest, who had simply been ahead of it the whole time, and had waited, with a discipline that looked from the outside like meekness, for the moment when being ahead of it would matter. She handed the nozzle back to Marlowe's second. Her hands were not shaking. That, more than anything, was the thing the team would remember. Marlowe's hands were shaking, a little, and he put them behind his back so no one would see. And the woman he had called Deadweight saw and said nothing, because there is a mercy in not seeing a proud man's hands shake, and she had already decided to be merciful long before he had earned it. In the control booth, Ronan Petrie stood with his palm flat against the glass. The drill officer beside him said something about resetting for the next evolution, and Petrie did not hear it. He was watching the woman coil down out of the smoke, and he said, quietly, to no one and to the whole room, the thing he had known since the pre-entry check and had spent an hour refusing. "That's not a contractor," he said. "I don't know who the evaluators think they sent us. That woman trains to a standard I've only ever read. She's fought this for real. If you have ever been the still one in a loud room, the one everybody carried right up until the moment they needed carrying, stay with this and subscribe to Honor Tales, because the room is about to learn exactly who it spent all afternoon laughing at." She had read a fire like that once before, and it had still taken one of hers. 2009. A warship at sea in the black hours, and a main machinery space on fire. Not a trainer's honest pan fire, but the real thing. Fuel and lube oil and pressure, and the whole roaring appetite of it, in a steel box 2 decks down with the sea on the other side of the hull. Lieutenant Sylvie Thorne, 28 years old, damage control assistant, had gone down into that space at the head of a hose team and stayed for hours, and she had held it together with the same still voice and the same flat hand on the same charged line, reading a fire that wanted the whole ship and telling it no, 1 compartment boundary at a time. Most of them lived. That was the thing the medal said afterward, the true and insufficient thing. Most of them lived. She pulled a department head named Warwick Coulson out of a smoke-filled passageway, with his lungs half gone and his leg broken, dragged him by the drag handle of his coveralls up a ladder she could not see, and he lived and became, in the years after, a man who could not speak of it without his voice changing. She remembered the heat of it in her body still, the way it had come through the deck plates, into the soles of her boots, until the rubber began to soften, the way the air in her mask had tasted of hot rubber and fear, the way the flame had walked the overhead of that machinery space in exactly the slow orange tide she had watched through the vision port an hour ago, so that the trainer's honest little pan fire had reached into her chest and pulled the whole night back up out of wherever she kept it. She remembered the sound most of all, not the roar. Everyone remembered the roar, but underneath it, the deep structural groan of steel expanding, a ship complaining in a register below hearing, the sound of a hull deciding whether to hold. She had knelt in that sound for 4 hours, with a hose team that kept losing men to exhaustion and heat, and kept being rebuilt from whoever could still stand, and she had held the boundary, one bulkhead, then the next, stealing the heat, refusing the flame the thing it wanted, which was the whole ship and everyone in it. Fireman Cal Winslow was 20 years old, and he did not live. He had gone back for a shipmate who was already out, in the confusion, the way 20-year-olds do, and the space had taken him in the dark before anyone could count him missing. And she had found him too late, and she carried that the way she carried everything, quietly, with a flat hand. She did not drown in it. That was the discipline. You carry them. You do not let them pull you under, because the next fire needs you dry-eyed. But she carried him. She had carried him down every passageway of every ship since. And then she had done the thing that was hers to do, the only answer she had ever found that was equal to the size of it. She wrote it down. She took what that fire had taught her, and she built it into a standard. How you rid a space, how you set a boundary, how you steal the heat before you chase the flame, how you keep a frozen man from becoming a dead one. And the standard was slow and inconvenient, and it made instructors do things the quiet way instead of the loud way, and the fleet adopted it. And now every damage control schoolhouse in the Navy trained to it, including this one. She was Captain Sylvie Thorne, 45 years old, the incoming commanding officer of this training command, come a day early in a contractor's coveralls to see how her schoolhouse trained when it did not know she was watching. The standard on the placard by that hatch had an author, and the author had spent the afternoon on the tail of Deke Marlowe's hose, being called Deadweight by a man teaching her own rules back to her, badly. They came out of the compartment dripping and alive, and Marlowe, who had felt the drill slip out of his hands and did not yet understand how it had come back, did the thing that would finish him. He looked for someone to hang it on, and there she was. Here is the thing about a near miss. It leaves everyone in the compartment holding a truth too large to look at directly, and a certain kind of man, rather than hold it, will hand it to someone else. Marlowe had felt the drill leave his hands. He had felt the fire get ahead of him, and he had felt it come back under a control that was not his. And somewhere beneath his certainty, he knew exactly what had happened, and exactly who had done it. And that knowledge was unbearable, and so he reached for the oldest relief there is, which is to make the near miss belong to someone other than himself. The evaluator got in the lane. It was almost elegant, the way a wrong thing can be elegant. He could not make himself wrong about the fire, so he would make her wrong for being near it. The command group was entering at the far hatch, a cluster of khaki and a few sets of dress whites, the base leadership walking the trainer on a scheduled visit, coffee in hand, the way senior people walk a thing they intend to praise. Marlowe saw them come, and he raised his voice for them, because a man like Marlowe always plays to the biggest audience in the room. "For the record," he said, pulling his hood back, loud enough to carry to the khaki, "the evolution stalled because the evaluator got in the lane. You don't put an untrained tourist on a hose team and call it a fair drill." He turned on Thorne, wet and certain and playing to the flag. "Clear my bay. Deadweight doesn't critique instructors. You want to write me up? You do it from the gallery like the rest of the tourists." She looked at him, and for the first time in the entire day, her face did something. It was not anger. It was almost gentle, and it was the most dangerous thing she had done yet. Because a room learns, if it lives long enough, that the still one who finally smiles is the one who has already won and is only waiting for you to notice. She had spent the whole day being underestimated, and she had let it happen, because being underestimated is not an insult to a person like Thorne. It is information. You learn more about a schoolhouse from the tail of a hose than you ever learn from the front of a formation. And she had learned everything she came to learn, that the instruction was brilliant and loud and one bad bulkhead away from a funeral, that the best hands in the building belonged to a man who had never been taught, that stillness is a skill, that a 19-year-old had frozen and been saved not by the curriculum, but by a stranger the curriculum had told him to ignore. She had come to see her schoolhouse honest, and it had shown her its whole self, its gift and its flaw both in a single afternoon, because it had not known she was watching. That was worth being called Deadweight for. It was worth more than any briefing she would ever have received as the commanding officer everyone was performing for. "Okay," she said. Behind Marlowe, one man in the command group had stopped walking. Rear Admiral Warwick Colson was 54 years old, and he had a cup of coffee in his hand, and a lung that still, on cold mornings, remembered a fire, and he had been half listening to the base commander talk about certification throughput when he saw, through the last drifting smoke of the reset compartment, a face. He knew that face. He had known it for 17 years. He had seen it last, through the smoke of the worst night of his life, upside down, hauling him toward air he had stopped believing in. He had looked for it at 100 ceremonies since, and never quite found it, because the woman it belonged to had a way of not being where the medals were. The Admiral set down his coffee. He did not say anything at first. He simply put the cup on the nearest gear locker, blindly, without looking at it, the way a man sets down anything that is suddenly in the way of the only thing that matters. And he straightened, and he came to attention. A flag officer, in a training bay, in front of a first-class petty officer and a hose team of terrified seamen, for no reason that any of them could see. His heels did not click. There was no order. There was only a 54-year-old admiral standing straight as a plumb line in a puddle of firewater, looking at a woman in a contractor's coveralls, and the whole loud room going quiet around the strangeness of it, the way a compartment goes quiet before it decides something. Marlowe's mouth was still open on the shape of the word he had just used. He turned to see what the Admiral was looking at, certain it must be something behind him. And there was nothing behind him but the deadweight. It moved across his face in the order it always moves. Confusion first. The flag officer and the contractor and the standing not fitting together. Then disbelief, the small headshake, the no. Then recognition, arriving all at once and locking. The soft coupling she had felt without looking. The nozzle pattern she had set an hour early. The two quiet words that had unfrozen his trainee when all his shouting had only welded the boy shut. The standard on the placard that he taught every day and had never once wondered who wrote. And then horror, plain and total, as the arithmetic finished itself and told him what he had spent the afternoon calling the woman an admiral had just risen to his feet for. "Sir," the base commander started, confused. "You don't have to—" "Yes," Colson said. "I do." His voice was very quiet, and it carried to every corner of the steel bay. "That is the officer who carried me out of a burning main space in 2009, on a ship that should have died, with most of her crew alive because she would not leave the boundary." He looked at the woman on the tail of the hose, and something in the look was 17 years old. "That's Captain Thorne. She wrote the book your man's been teaching." The words went through the bay like water, finding every low place at once. She wrote the book. The trainees who had spent the afternoon saying dead weight into their masks felt the sentence land in their stomachs, because every one of them had held that book, had been drilled out of that book, had passed or failed by that book, and had never once thought to wonder whose hands had first learned the things it taught. Now they knew. The hands were on the tail of their hose. The book had been written in a fire exactly like the one they had barely survived that afternoon, by the woman who had barely survived it first, and had turned her survival into their instruction, so that a 19-year-old could freeze at a boundary 17 years later and still walk out alive. Marlowe had been teaching her own words back to her all afternoon, loudly, and calling the author dead weight while he did it. For a long moment, no one moved, and no one breathed, and the only sound in the great steel bay was the slow weeping of the hose bib and the tick of cooling metal. The command group stood frozen with their coffee, The trainees stood frozen at the hatch, and in the center of it, the Admiral held his attention like a man holding a salute at a graveside, and the woman on the tail of the hose looked back at him with something in her face that was not triumph and was not even quite acknowledgement. It was the look of two people who had once been in a fire together and had never needed words about it since. 17 years passed between them in the length of that look, and none of it was spoken, because the truest debts never are. Ronan Petrie was already at attention. He had been at attention since the coupling. Now the trainees followed, raggedly, one and then three, and then all of them. And Frayne, 19, soot-streaked, alive because of 2 quiet words, came to attention with tears standing in his eyes, and did not know why. And beside him, a whisper went around the bay that had been going around it since the smoke first cleared. "Sir, who is she?" And now, at last, the room knew. The question had been passing between the trainees since the smoke first cleared, a whisper with no answer, and it had a different weight in every mouth that carried it. In Frayne's, it was awe. In the trainees, it was shame, the particular shame of having laughed along. In Marlowe's, it was not a whisper at all, but a silence, the silence of a man reassembling his entire afternoon around a single fact he could not put down: that the person he had chosen, out of all the people in the bay, to be beneath the team, had been the one person in the bay who could have taught every instructor in it, and that his certainty, the thing he had spent his whole career polishing, had pointed him at exactly the wrong target, with exactly the confidence that made it unforgivable. The Admiral stood. The room stood. And the woman they had called Deadweight simply took off her fire gloves, one finger at a time, and set them on the coiled hose with the same economy she had done everything else all day, as if the standing of admirals were a small weather that would pass. Marlowe's mouth was still open on the word deadweight. No one in the bay was laughing. Coulson found her first, before the paperwork, before anything. He crossed the wet deck to her, while the command group still stood in its confusion, and the two of them stood a little apart from the room, and for a moment, the Rear Admiral did not seem like a flag officer at all, only a man of 54, with a lung that remembered a fire, looking at the person who had given him the years he had spent since. "I looked for you," he said, "at the ceremony. After. For a long time." "I know," she said. "You were never where the medals were." "No." He nodded slowly, as though that were the most familiar thing in the world about her, which it was. "Winslow," he said, and it was not a question, only the name, offered the way you offer a name to the one other person who carries it. "I've got him," she said. 2 words, and the Admiral understood, because he carried a version of the same weight, that she meant she still did, every day, and always would, and that this was not a wound she wanted reopened in front of a training bay. He let it go. That was its own kind of salute. There was no arrest. There is not always an arrest. That is a thing the loud stories forget. Deke Marlowe had committed no crime. He had committed the oldest error there is, the one that has nothing to do with courage or skill and everything to do with the eye. He had looked at a quiet woman in borrowed coveralls and decided he already knew the size of her, and he had been wrong by the entire width of an ocean. He was still, when you took the certainty away, the best pair of hands in the building. And Captain Sylvie Thorne had spent her whole career learning that you do not answer a fire by burning down everything near it, and you do not answer a talented man's arrogance by ending him. You answer it the way you answer a fire. You steal the heat out of it, and you save what is worth saving. She corrected him in front of no one. When the command group had moved on, and the bay had emptied toward the showers, she found him at the gear locker, re-racking hose he did not need to re-rack because his hands needed something to do, and she did not raise her voice because she had never once needed to. "You're good," she said. "You were wrong. Both are true at the same time. And if you can hold both without letting go of either, you'll be one of the finest instructors this Navy has. Let go of either one, and you'll be a story sailors tell about the day the Deadweight took the nozzle. She set a copy of the standard on the locker beside him. Her standard, the one with no name on the cover because she had never put her name on it. You teach this. You've been teaching it loud. Teach it right. You'll work for me now, and you'll be better than you were, because I have no use at all for humiliating a man who can fight fire. I only have use for a man who can teach a 19-year-old not to freeze. Marlowe looked at the standard. He looked at his own hands. Aye, Captain. His voice was not the voice from the brief. It was smaller, and it was truer. And the truer voice was the first thing about the whole day that gave her hope for him. Ask me the question, she said. You want to ask it? Ask. He looked up, and after a moment, quietly, the loud man asked the quiet question. Why didn't you say something? At the start, you could have flashed a badge in the brief and you'd have performed for me, she said. The way this whole floor performs for a set of stars in the doorway. I'd have seen the schoolhouse you show visitors. I needed the one you run when you think nobody's watching. She let that settle. That's the last thing I'll teach you today, and it's the most important. The fire doesn't care about your rank, and neither do I. It only cares whether you were honest in the dark. You were good in the dark, and wrong in the dark. Both. Be a man who can hear that, and you'll be worth 10 of the ones who only look good in the doorway. If you have ever watched someone answer contempt with mercy and get more done by it than any punishment ever managed, that is the whole reason this channel exists. So do the small thing and subscribe to Honor Tales, because the quiet answer is the strong one, and you should be here every time it lands. She found Frayne last by the mask-cleaning sink, still shaking a little the way a man shakes for an hour after the fire lets him go. She did not tell him he had done well, because he hadn't, and he knew he had not, and a lie would have been worse than useless. You froze, she said. Everybody's first real heat. Something in them votes to stop. Yours voted loud. She let that sit. You came back when I called you. That's the only thing that matters in the end. Not that you froze, but that you could be brought back. Most can't teach that. You've already got it. She almost smiled. Stay in this Navy. Learn to be still. Someday, you'll be the one with your hand on a frozen boy's shoulder, and you'll remember 2 words, and you'll give them away. Frayne nodded and could not speak, and did not have to. He would stay in the Navy. He would learn to be still. Years later, at a different schoolhouse, he would take the nozzle out of a locked pair of hands and put his mask to a terrified hood and say, "With me." And a body would come unstuck, and a compartment would decide against killing everyone in it. And he would never once tell the story of where he learned it, because the woman who taught it to him had never told hers either. That is how a standard actually moves through a fleet, not on paper, though the paper matters, but in the quiet handing of 2 words from the saved to the saving. Down a chain of dark compartments no ceremony will ever see. Later, when the trainer was dark and dripping and the others had gone, Captain Thorne stood alone in the doorway of the compartment she had put out and let herself think, for exactly 1 breath, about a 20-year-old named Cal Winslow, who had gone back into the dark for a shipmate already saved, and who was the reason there was a standard at all. She did not drown in it. She never had. She carried him out of the bay the way she had carried him down every passageway since, quietly, with a flat hand. And in the morning, she would put on her service uniform and take command of this schoolhouse in the daylight, with her name read aloud and everyone watching, and she would make it train truer than it had trained the day before. Somewhere, a standard held, and a fire lost, because she never stopped reading it. And in the gray dawn of the morning after, when a soot-streaked seaman asked an old Master Chief who she was, the answer took a long time, because the true answers always do. Ronan Petrie told it the way you tell a thing you have earned the right to tell. Slowly, with the coffee going cold, leaving out the parts that were hers to keep. He told the boy about hands that could find a soft coupling in the dark. He told him about a fire in 2009 that most of a crew had walked away from, and about the one who had not, and about a standard with no name on its cover that had been quietly saving sailors ever since, in 100 compartments like this one. He did not tell the boy that he had spent 30 years hoping to serve one more time with hands like that, and had given up on it, and had gotten his wish on an ordinary Tuesday in a schoolhouse he thought held no more surprises. Some things a Master Chief keeps, and the keeping of them is its own kind of honor, the kind that never makes it onto a citation, and matters more than most of the ones that do. When he was done, Frayne sat for a while in the ticking quiet of the cooled steel, and then he stood and squared himself and went to find the mask he would clean better today than he had cleaned it yesterday, because he had learned the thing the whole schoolhouse had learned in one afternoon, that the quiet one on the tail of the hose might be the one who saves your life, and that you had better learn to be still, because someday the quiet one is supposed to be you. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.